be able to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are. Welcome to this online seminar of the Institute for European, Russian and Eurasian Studies. And today we will be discussing the Russian Orthodox Church, ideology, politics and war. And this is an online seminar co-organized by our Illiberalism Studies Program and our newly launched Russia program at the Institute. My name is Marlène Larel. I'm the director of these programs, and I'm delighted to have you with us today with really a wonderful group of scholars who are all on one way or another looking at what is happening around the Russian Orthodox Church. What is interesting when you look at the scholarship on the Russian Orthodox Church is that there was a pretty good amount of scholarship done in the late 2000s, early 2000s, and then for several years, very few things. And now you have a kind of blossoming of research once again that began even before the war. And I think the position of the church during the war has kind of relaunched the wheel of scholars to try to understand what is happening both inside the church, in the relationship between the church and the state, the relationship between the church and the society, the relationship between the Russian church and what is happening in the other Orthodox parishes in Ukraine, in the Baltic state, in globally the post-Soviet region. So a lot of different way of looking at that, and also looking at the role of the church globally and its global outreach around the notions of conservative values. So we have 5 hours today and about 10 great speakers to look at all these different aspects. We organized the event around 4 panels. The first one will be discussing Kristina Stoeckl and Dmitry Uzlaner new books called The Moralist International, Russia in the Global Culture War, that they will be presenting in a few minutes. And it's really the best book you can read on how Russia and the church in particular has been kind of globally connected to the culture war debates and their connection with Europe and the US. In the second panel, we will be looking at the Russian Orthodox Church and the war, looking at different aspects of how the church is positioning itself toward the war. I will be presenting our speakers for that panel. We will have a third panel on the Russian Orthodox Church and the state that will be here looking at how the church and the different elements of Putinism and the relationship to societies have been developing over the years. And then we will have a last panel where we will look at kind of Orthodox geopolitics, and especially looking at what is happening in Ukraine and in the Baltic state. So I hope that will be of interest to you. We will have a Q&A session at the end of each panel, so there will be time for you to ask questions, and I will be moderating the discussion. So without further ado, let me check if we have everybody here. Yeah, that's perfect. I would like to invite Kristina Stoeckl from University of Innsbruck and soon in Italy, and Dmitry Uzlaner, also from University of Innsbruck, but also now based in Israel, to present their book, The Moralist International, Russia in the Global Culture War. Kristina and Dima, I give you about between 20-30 minutes to do the presentation, the two of you, so we have time for a Q&A session, and then we will be done in like 55 minutes to move to the second panel. So welcome once again, and Kristina, the floor is yours.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. I have also shared my screen, so you can see the presentation, and we will divide the presentation. So I start, and then Dmitry will come in, speak about part 1 of the book, and then I will speak about the second part of the book. So it's a pleasure to be able to present our book, which was just out in print in December, on December 20th, to this group and to all the people who are following online. Let me say a few words about the research project that informs the research that went into this book. So for the last 6 years, I directed a research project entitled Post-Secular Conflicts at the University of Innsbruck. This was a project funded by the European Research Council as a starting grant. And for those of you who are familiar with these type of grants, they're quite powerful, high grants, so you can really work in a team, and that's what we did. And I actually put the names of my collaborators there. I'm also happy to sort of name them here. We had PhDs involved in the project. That was Caroline Hill, Alena Kostenko, and Ksenia Medvedeva. And then we had postdocs who collaborated with the project. That's, of course, Dmitry, my co-author, but also Julia Morao-Permosa and Vera Pozzi and Philippe Ayoub, who I now forgot to put his name here. And then we had visiting fellows, external collaborators, people who came in at different moments of the project, such as Sergei Chapnin, Boris Knorres, or people who are also here now, Andrei Zhizhkov, Georgios Trantas, and Pasquale Anichino. We published a lot, and the book is only one of these publications, and you can find the others through our website. So the post-secular conflicts research project wanted to do several things. It wanted to explore the agenda and transnational networks of traditionalist, moral conservative actors and the role of Russian Orthodoxy therein. Now, is immediately a few caveats. In the project, we opted for the term moral conservative actors. We didn't use illiberalism because I think we weren't ready yet at the time. I think it's very good that Marlene is now pushing the term, but I didn't, even though I think the groups we look at are very similar. We didn't use other terms like the global right wing or the term from Clifford Bob or the Christian right, even though also these terms, they basically mean the same group, but what we meant with the networks of traditionalist moral conservative actors was also in a way intended of potentially going beyond the Christian realm only, including also Jewish and Muslim actors. So we wanted to study these transnational networks with regard to three main areas where religious moral conflicts emerge. Religious freedom, so questions regarding religious symbols in the public sphere and free speech, blasphemy. Family, questions regarding gender, generational equality, and life, questions regarding bioethical questions and challenges in biotechnology. So abortion basically was the main question here. And we studied these issues by looking at debates between political actors and civil society actors across 4 international institutional settings: the United Nations Human Rights Council and other UN institutions, the Council of Europe, the European Court of Human Rights, and forums of interreligious and civil society dialogue. Now, we were not the first people who studied sort of the global culture wars or the globalization of the culture wars. That has actually been a theme that's been around, and especially Clifford Bob, who wrote the book, The Global Right Wing, has talked about the American culture wars, the conflict between progressive groups in society and conservative groups in society over difficult ethical, religious, moral questions. That culture wars that define, in a way, the American political scene, that they have globalized since the early 90s, especially since the mid-90s, 94, 95 is usually the period where scholars agree that it started. So there's research on that. But there was very little research really on how Russia suddenly starts to connect to the lines and groups that are moving in the global culture wars and what role Russia actually plays, and especially the Russian Orthodox Church. And I should say that I came to this project from a previous project on human rights discourse inside the Russian Orthodox Church. And what I noticed studying how the Moscow Patriarchate uses human rights is that they're not only starting to use the concept, but they're also starting to design policies on the concept. And they're actually using the concept of human rights in order to speak to actors in the West, like-minded actors, and to pursue their goals. For example, a definition of freedom of religion and belief, that should really mean, in a way, safeguarding the Christians in the public sphere, sort of an interpretation of freedom of religion, for example, questions of blasphemy, or using human rights language also to speak about life issues, abortions, or the life of the unborn, So how human rights can be used in different ways for progressive aims, for conservative aims. And I was alerted to the fact that Russian Orthodox actors started to use that, and I wanted to find out more about where and how they do it. And how did we find out more about this? We embarked on a very extensive field work from 2016 to 2019. Now, with looking back, of course, we're extremely lucky. It was before the pandemic. We could still, these conventions were still taking place, the gatherings of the World Congress of Families in several countries in Europe, other gatherings, moral conservative actors, conventions like on homeschooling. And we attended. So we attended these gatherings. We used them to identify key actors, NGO leaders, and then we reached out to them, doing interviews with many of them. We did more than 120 interviews with actors, and almost more than half of these interviews were with Russian actors. So, for example, the Russian founder of the World Congress of Families, the current Russian director of the World Congress of Families, and so on. And this research then really, we published a lot of this, and one of the main outcomes is the book, The Moralist International, Russia and the Global Culture Wars. And I really want to say now, also for those following us online, this book has been published in print, but also open access, so the electronic version. And that electronic version is actually for free, because the European Research Council does a good thing, saying that research paid with taxpayers' money should also be available for taxpayers. So you can download it from these platforms that I've put on the slide. And I think the content will become clearer now when we just look at the table of contents. And we have a part 1, which we entitled Learning the Culture Wars, and the part 2, Doing the Culture Wars. And I leave the part 1, Learning the Culture Wars, to Dmitry, and then I'll come back for the doing part.
Okay, thank you, Kristina. Yes, I would like to talk about the first part of the book. As you see the table of contents, it's called Learning the Culture Wars. And in this part, we tell the story of how Russian moral conservative actors, how they first adopted the language and the logic of culture wars, and how they started to see themselves as cultural warriors on the side of social conservatism. And we also tell the story of how this logic of culture wars and how this social conservatism evolved from being a kind of a marginal worldview, which was known only to experts in the field of contemporary Russian studies, how it turned to a kind of a mainstream ideological current in the second decade of the 21st century. And in order to do this, we make a theoretical contribution. So our book is not only an empirical research, but we also make a theoretical contribution to the field of social theory and sociology of religion. And we do it by coining the concept of conservative aggiornamento. And with this concept, we want to explain a very paradoxical aspect of this new Russian social conservatism. So though it is claimed that this social conservatism, that these traditional values are rooted in authentic Russian tradition, especially in the tradition of the Russian Orthodox Church, as a matter of fact, this is a very new and a kind of unprecedented phenomenon. So if we take, for example, Russian Orthodox Church, then it generally lacked any systematic tradition of social ethics before the end of the 20th century, as opposed, for example, to the Western churches. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, the church had no resources to make sense of the current social and cultural conflicts and to offer itself as a solution to these conflicts. And in order to do this, it had to learn a lot. And this particular process of learning we call conservative aggiornamento. This was a kind of a modernization of religious tradition, but as opposed to kind of a standard understanding of aggiornamento, which assumes evolution in the direction of progressive liberal values, this was a modernization in the direction of conservative and anti-liberal values. And the outcome of this learning, the outcome of this conservative modernization, is the traditional values conservatism that we see today. And we consider it in the book as a kind of a hybrid, which brings together different elements. Partly it's late Soviet conservative ethos, then some elements from Russian Orthodox tradition, then of course reactions to the grievances of the 1990s, and of course the final element that we emphasize are the strong transnational influences. And these transnational influences are the focus of our book, at least the focus of the first part of our book. And here we see kind of another paradox of this conservatism. Though it claims to be authentic, kind of Russian, anti-Western, as a matter of fact, it was formed under heavy influences from the West. So a lot of ideas, materials, know-hows were adopted by Russian moral conservative actors in order to make this conservative aggiornamento possible. And the source of this learning was, of course, the West. And in the second chapter of the first part of our book, we show how this happened, how these groups were coming to Russia and how they were more than ready to share their vision of the world and their solutions to current social and cultural conflicts. And we in the book, we trace these contacts since late 1980s. And it's interesting that initially, these were contacts between Russian academics and American, of course, not only American, but also American conservative actors. And for example, we tell the story of the focus on the family, the Commission project, and also we tell the story of now famous World Congress of Families. In the next chapter, we tell the story of Peterim Sorokin, who is a very interesting person and who in recent decades served as a kind of an intellectual bridge connecting conservative actors from Russia and from America. I mean, he's mutually respected both by American conservatives, because in America he is famous, at least in these circles, for his criticism of American sexual revolution and for his intellectual defense of family values. And in Russia, he became very popular among conservatives because he was like seen as a representative of the conservative tradition in the field of sociology and social theory. So as I said, that initially these contacts were mainly with Russian academics from Moscow State University, from the Institute of Sociology, and the church actors, they were present only on the background. So the church itself, it emerges on the map a bit later. It emerges in the end of the 1990s, when the church voiced its ambition to become a kind of a moral leader of Russian society without any assistance from the Western partners. And here, kind of a key date is 1997, which is kind of the year when the new law on religious freedom was adopted in Russia, which kind of severely limited these freedoms. And in that sense, we consider the figure of Kirill, current patriarch. At that time, he was a metropolitan, as a figure of a key importance. And for example, we analyze his article, which was written in the year 2000, the article which was called Norms of Faith as a Norm of Life. And in this article, Kirill shares his views on contemporary society and its conflicts, as well as on the role that the church should play in these conflicts. And this text is significant because it contained a kind of a compressed program of the new role that Kirill envisioned for orthodoxy in Russian society and in the world. In this article, Kirill presented a kind of a roadmap for the church, which was to transform itself into a genuine public religion, capable of, I quote, defining the future face of human civilization. And the agenda of the conservative aggiornamento of Russian Orthodox Church emerges from the lines of this article in considerable clarity. So Russian Orthodox Church should not retreat from the modern world, nor should it seek accommodation with a secular liberal order, but it should actively engage with the modern world and, if necessary, fight against liberalism and secularism. Kirill sketches out his vision of the fundamental contradiction of our era and at the same time, the main challenge to the human community in the 21st century. And by this contradiction, he means a clash between liberal civilization standards on the one hand, and the values of national, cultural, and religious identity on the other. And he sees the task of orthodoxy in challenging the hegemony of these liberal civilization standards and criticizing them from the position, I quote, of a system of traditional values of Russia, based on a way of life rooted in the tradition of the church. So this fundamental contradiction of our era that Kirill describes in this article is another way of referring to the culture wars, which he depicts both as a global and as a Russian predicament. Though in this article, Kirill offers a kind of an extremely ambitious plan, at the same time, he acknowledges that the Russian Orthodox Church has a fundamental problem. It lacks the intellectual and theological resources to perform this task. As he says, we did not know any of this until yesterday. This is how he summarizes the experience of Orthodox reflection on the agenda of contemporary culture wars. And he adds that the church may need to take into account the experience of our Orthodox brothers in the West who face similar problems before us. And he adds, it may be useful to study the positions of other confessions. So developing an original Orthodox approach to contemporary society is, I quote, the creative task of modern Orthodox theology. So Kirill's position accurately illustrates this conservative aggiornamento agenda. And the process of learning on the part of the Russian Orthodox Church, it took some time. And here, as Kristina mentioned, Kristina wrote a lot, Kristina Stoeckl wrote a lot on this evolution, on this conservative aggiornamento in regards to the Russian Orthodox views on human rights that allowed the church to put forward its position and become a participant in the global culture wars. So she says a few words about this, and also you can find, if you're interested in this topic, you can find a lot on this topic in her books and articles on the subject. So it was the church. And now the final kind of chapter, the final part is the state, which comes after the church. And I should say that this turn to traditional values by the state was something surprising and quite unexpected, because it happened 10 years ago. And well, when Dmitry Medvedev was the president, the agenda was that of democratization and restart of the relations with Western partners. So it was absolutely unexpected. So it was expected that in the second decade of the 21st century, this movement would continue. But as a result of the suppression of the protests of 2011 and 2012, the period of reaction started. And this reaction required some ideological justifications, and this conservatism of traditional values, which was developed by the church, became such an ideological justification. So Russia was quickly reframing itself along the lines of this culture wars agenda and global culture wars, where the country had a mission to be the last stronghold of traditional values and the keeper of authentic values of Russian tradition and culture. And I should say that in the beginning, all this seemed to be a very shaky ideological foundation, but it was growing and it was expanding, and it reached its peak in 2020, when the new text of Russian constitution was adopted, which now contains a commitment to traditional values and precludes the possibility of future legislative changes for the recognition, for example, of the same-sex marriage. So kind of a conclusion, so this conservative of traditional values and this logic of culture wars behind it, it made an unexampled career in Russia. From being a marginal worldview brought to Russia by entrepreneurial Western conservative actors, it became almost a semi-official state ideology. And well, I call this process colonization of Russia by traditional values, or alternatively, one can say that Russia was kind of baptized in the faith of traditional values. So that's kind of summary of the first part. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Dmitry. I will continue now and speak about the second part. So the second part is really the empirical research into these norm entrepreneurs. So how did that happen, in terms of personal connections in terms of papers published. And part 2 is called Doing the Culture Wars, and it has 4 chapters. And the first chapter is about the Russian Orthodox Church and its transnational conservative alliances. It's about ecumenical relations. So how does the Moscow Patriarchate develop its profile as a stronghold of Christian values, a really conservative actor in the Christian ecumenical sphere? And it's important here to consider the background to it. In 2013, when Pope Francis steps in for Pope Benedict, or Pope Benedict retires, inside the Catholic Church, there was a sense of a shift in direction, of a shift in priorities. Pope Francis stood much more for other topics inside the Catholic Church: poverty, migration, and family and values, and the fight against gender ideology was deemed less important. And in that moment, I think the Moscow Patriarchate saw a chance to step in and become kind of the true conservative Christian church. The arrival of Pope Francis also ended a plan which Metropolitan Ilarion Alfeev had inaugurated around 2008, namely that of a holy alliance. A holy alliance between the Vatican and the Moscow Patriarchate. It's a term that was invented by an Italian journalist, and it translated into a period of quite an intense ecumenical interaction. In some of these, I even took part, actually, living in Italy, exchange of icons, exchange of crosses, translations of books. So there was a lot of interaction between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Vatican in particular, and in other countries with religious actors. So the first, this chapter 5, is focused in a way on what the Moscow Patriarchate does in terms of its transnational relations. We also look at connection to the Billy Graham Evangelical Church, for example. Now, chapter 6 that's the one where the bulk of our research on the World Congress of Families went into, and our interview material at the World Congress of Families and at the Homeschooling Congress that was held in St. Petersburg. And it is also that chapter around which I then started to use or to propose the term the Russian Christian right. Because what was very apparent to me as a sociologist, in a way, was that this group of actors we were seeing there, their way of doing things, their way of presenting themselves as Orthodox or representatives of Orthodox Russia, had very little, in a way, of that traditional Russian Orthodoxy, which I was more familiar with from studying the church and studying maybe religious intellectuals. So these are really entrepreneurs who were proposing themselves as to organize things like a bus that would drive around the city with anti-gender slogans, a picket in front of the Mexican embassy in Moscow to protest against Mexico passing a law on same-sex marriage, inviting a large international crowd to a homeschooling congress in St. Petersburg, starting a homeschooling curriculum in Russian, translated from an American homeschooling curriculum, the classical conversations one. So really that chapter 6, I think it shows very clearly why we say that's a new phenomenon. It should also be said that the group we study there is not very numerous in terms of people. It's basically built around the World Congress of Families and who drives this inside Russia. And it's also the group that is connected with Konstantin Malofeev, on whom Marlene has done a lot of research. So this is really, I think, a group that has also then later on generated a lot of interest by investigative journalists and so on how it actually happened that one group inside the religious political milieu developed in the traditional values, developed a whole agenda, a portfolio of contacts, of strategies, of events, claims that could then be offered in a way to the government to use. Chapter 7 is another chapter in order to exemplify, in a way, that learning process. And it's about the Russian Orthodox anti-abortion discourse in a transnational context. This is, in a way, it's a small case study, but it's very clear. It's a very vivid one because it's well known that the first anti-abortion NGOs in Russia were actually founded by American Christian right pro-lifers, sort of recruiting and encouraging Russians to think about the wrongs of abortion. Material was translated, for example, and strategies were adopted. So that's a small case study in the book about that fact. And the last chapter is about how this traditional values discourse has translated into Russian foreign diplomacy. So this is really about diplomatic action at the United Nations, Human Rights Council, and where Russia wants to emerge as a leader, at this point a global leader, on traditional values and topics that sort of stop a liberal progressive understanding of human rights. We look at two sets of resolutions between 2008 and between 2015, resolutions proposed by Russia, supported by Russia, on traditional values, the role of traditional values for the promotion of human rights, and the role of the family. So Russia emerged in that UN context as an important country with, and that's very important, a powerful diplomatic apparatus. There's just a lot of people, they're very professional, investing and pushing for an agenda that aims at blocking progressive proposal on human rights. Things like enlarging the definition of families to include diverse families or more gender inclusive language in some aspects. So they basically, I mean, the American Christian right groups and NGOs have been doing that for a long time. The American government, depending on which administration you have, they sort of push more on this or push more on the other side. I think then with the adoption of the traditional values as a principle of Russian foreign policy, we see really that Russia is taking a leadership role. We also did interviews at the UN for the sort of talking to experts to ask them concretely, do you think the role of Russia has changed? And everyone in a way confirmed, yes, Russia is trying to take over leadership. Now I'm coming to the end. Maybe just a quick look back to the cover. The book was written when the war started. And so with the outbreak of the war, we went back to look at the preface and the epilogue, and we also went back to change the cover of the book, because what we didn't see coming, but what I think is very clear now, is that the global culture of wars have really, in a way, translated into a scheme of justification for a real war, and these traditional values have increasingly become weaponized. So I'm looking forward to your questions and the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristina and Dima, for this presentation, and congratulations for the book. And I think the last point you mentioned is a very important one that I think we will be discussing in the second panel. Maybe so I invite first our panelists to ask a question. Also, I would like to give them the floor if they have questions, and our attendees to not hesitating to ask a question. We have one first question coming from our colleague, Peter Mandaville, asking Kristina and Dmitry, I'm reading the book now, thank you so much for this valuable work. I would be curious to know how you as researcher were regarded by the groups you were studying. What did they make of the interest you were expressing in them? Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes. Let's begin with this one.
Okay, yes. I mean, we introduced ourselves as sociologists of religion who are interested in how religious actors bring in their instances into the public sphere. So how they act publicly, politically. And they were very open. I mean, really, I think we also got to this research at a point in time where people were still willing to talk, of course, with consent forms and anonymity. And they, I mean, we did say we are researchers, but they were willing to talk. I was actually surprised. And I think now this would no longer be possible.
Dima, would you like to add something on how people reacted?
Well, I should say that, yeah, surprisingly, the reaction was quite positive. And for example, we did several interviews with Alan Carson, who is one of the founders and inspirers of the World Congress of Families. And we wrote an article on the Journal of Classical Sociology on Pitirim Sorokin, and where we discussed Carlson as a kind of a person who, to a certain extent, continues some of the ideas of Pitirim Sorokin. And well, Carlson was glad to read this article. So yeah, in that sense, quite surprisingly, yes, as Kristina said, these people were quite open, so they were ready to talk. Yes.
Wonderful. Another question on the fact that in the late 90s, early 2000, Huntington's clash of civilization paradigm was very influential in Russia. And so the question is about whether a shift from geographical religious block to kind of value blocks, like, right? So that it's no more, so because what we have now is really Russia against the West against Russia. But what these networks were telling us is that Russia and some part of the West were sharing something together against another part of the West and another part of Russia, right? So how do you see this kind of shift between the kind of the vision of the war that is value-based and that still exists, in fact, and the one that is more geopolitical, and how they were managing these tensions?
Yes, you completely summed it up. That's our introduction, basically, in the book. We write exactly that. We noticed exactly that, and that was also what we meant with post-secular conflicts. So these divides are not between cultural blocks or civilizations. They run through each and every country. And in that sense, they are a predicament for each and every society. So I wouldn't even add more, because you have already completely answered it. Maybe, Dmitry, if you want to add something.
I want just to add that, yes, when we were talking about post-secular conflicts, yes, we meant that it's not a conflict between civilizations or a conflict between religious groups and secular groups, but we wanted to stress that this division, it goes across religious traditions and religious communities. And we now see this with Ukraine, where there are Orthodox believers on both sides. And it's not a clash of civilization, it's a kind of a clash inside one civilization. And that's, of course, is not what I guess Huntington was assuming when he was putting forward his idea.
Thank you so much. Questions are coming now, so I have several of them. One from our colleague, Maria Sidorkina. Any research on broader believers' uptake of this kind of activist narrative? And she's explaining that Orthodox parishes are decentralized. So do you know if any of these projects aimed at spreading traditional values agenda were done through the parishes, really, right, at the local grassroots level, or was that addressed mostly through the public sphere, right, by, I don't know, narratives, television, poster, picket, or if really there was a kind of grassroots work at the level of parishes to spread that visions?
I mean, first of all, it was not really part of our methodology to look at where this goes inside Russia. So we also, just by the material we collected, we looked mostly at transnational networks. We also, I mean, I can think about some instances where we saw that this in a way spreads, but it was still on TV. For example, a bishop like the Archpriest Smirnov, the head of the Patriarchal Commission for Family, he has a TV program and he would speak about this. He would also invite American friends, actors, to speak about their ideas and to present their programs. So we didn't look into the parishes.
Mm-hmm. Dima, anything you want to add on that grassroots aspect?
I can only add that grassroots level in Russia is not that efficient. It's much more efficient to act on the level of the state. I mean, the biggest success of this new conservatism was the new text of the Russian Constitution, which basically introduced this ideology into the most important document. And in that sense, it's much more important than grassroots activity.
Very good. And then we have several questions that I will summarize in one global one about the kind of the ideological aspect of these traditional values. So could you comment on the church referring to kind of global conspiracy, especially the Great Reset conspiracy? Did you find any kind of influence of neo-Eurasianism narratives or reference to the Russian world narrative on the way the church has been framing the conservative values?
I think this goes in different directions, because the Great Reset it's very popular among the right in Europe, because they're very much worried about Islam and migration from Muslim countries. But that's different in Russia, where traditional values include also Islam. So this is actually a point that they do not have in common, this use of Christianity vis-a-vis Islam. On the influence of Dugin and neo-Eurasianism, I have to admit that this for me is also a puzzle, because as I before said, this group is related to Malofeev, just as Dugin working for Zagrad is also related to Malofeev. But by looking at it from the outside, I saw them in a way working in two opposite ideological directions, because the groups we studied, they collaborated very closely with Western paradigms. They actually copied a lot of them. They copied a lot of practices. And the only point, I think, where I would say clearly that this was going into the direction of a Russian world ideology is in a way in seeing their outreach. The World Congress of Families had tried to have an outreach towards Ukraine, towards Belarus. They'd never organized a Congress there, but they traveled, I think, in view of organizing one. They also organized one in Tbilisi or in Chisinau in Moldova. So I think that it is clear that this group was in a way using this traditional values agenda in order to convey to countries at the periphery of that Russian world, or in between the sphere of influence of the European Union and the sphere of influence of Russia, to position Russia as we are the ones that stand for the traditional family. If you go for the EU, then you will get LGBT rights, and now you make the choice. So in the congresses we witnessed, that was very clearly the message in Chisinau and in Tbilisi.
Dima, something to add? No. Okay. Another question on the fact that you indicated that the Russian government turned to moral traditionalism as a kind of ideological platform about a decade ago. So when Putin came back to power after the Medvedev presidency. And so the question is, why do you think he embraced this worldview? Is that something opportunistic, or did he genuinely reflect his personal values? And do you think the Kremlin see this traditionalism as a way to activate a loyal base of support within the Russian population?
Well, it's a very complicated question, but in my view, there was no other option. I mean, there was no other ideology, and in my view, after Medvedev, there was this hope that this democratization and liberalization will continue, that new social groups were emerging, like this middle class citizens of big Russian cities who were asking for political representation. And in my understanding, all this was considered to be very dangerous. And there was a decision to stop this and to start the reaction. And the only ideology that could be the justification for this reaction was that of traditional values, kind of return to good old times when everything was perfect. So I think that this was the reason behind this choice of ideology. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Kristina, do you want to add something on that? Not necessarily. Yeah, good. Two other questions that I kind of putting together on how do you think the regime understand that it was a kind of soft power tool to be used, this traditional agenda, traditional value agenda, to speak to European and American or global constituencies? And do we have any information about the way the security services or the secret services use that as really a tool of influence, you know, like creating network, creating kind of friendships and using that. So the kind of instrumental aspect by the government of this outreach made by the church and the kind of political actor around it.
So I think it's very clear that for the Russian state, at least in where we look at the diplomatic part of it, is a tool. And so what we want to emphasize in a way is that in order to first to use that tool, there was really a shift in perception was necessary between what global conflicts are about, because now we are in a time when the global conflict is again about Russia against the West, right? But there was a moment, I think that's what we want to show in the year 2000s and in the 2010s, where the new global conflict is about, you know, conservative versus progressive values, liberal versus illiberalism, liberal democracy versus other types of democracy or autocracy. And there are many groups and partners in the West. So this is not the West against the rest or Russia against the rest. It's really, it cuts across. And so there were evidently groups in Western Europe and in the US who Russia was catering to, and vice versa. I mean, look at contracts of friendship and agreement made between the French Rassemblement, at the time it was the Front National, and the Kremlin, or between the Austrian FPÖ and United Russia Party, or between Salvini in Italy and United Russia Party. So this, now we didn't look at these sort of party contracts because they contain also other topics, not only these value topics, but I think the phenomenon we look at goes into the same direction. And there were actually also personal overlaps in these contexts. And I think with the US, it was a bit trickier because the US Christian right and these NGOs at the time of the Obama administration, American conservatives really thought that they were actually about to lose the culture wars. So they were actually looking for allies abroad, not only in Russia, but also in Europe. And then with the election of Trump and the whole story and excitement about, you know, the Russian collusion, my sense is that they're also trying to tone down some of this connection, or maybe even to obfuscate a little bit the connections they had. So, you know, we are not investigative journalists and not political scientists. We came to this more as sociologists of social movements, sociology of religion. And so in a way, it's for me, it's impossible to answer that question on Secret Service and whether this was like planned a long time ahead. But what I do think is remarkable are in a way two movements. So that the World Congress of Families started in academia and moved into the church around 2007, between 2009. I would say that in 2012, this move was complete. And that at one point, a new generation appeared of leaders, because we say these connections go back a long time. And there were people inside the church who, you know, priests or who were not necessarily extremely able to organize things, to get things going, to raise a lot of money inside Russia. Then in 2009, 2007, we get, you know, young, able managers who do things like bring the World Congress of Families to Moscow in 2014 and organize a laser show in the Kremlin. And so now, you know, you make up your mind on what that is. But of course, the kind of research we did, you cannot ask for these things because then your research stops there.
Yes, thank you. One more question from our colleague, Masha Lipman. You mentioned that the concept of traditional value is new to the church, and then that wasn't much in terms of written ecclesiastic sources. So had the church discovered such sources in more recent years? Does it pretend that there is in fact a kind of orthodox moral teaching dating from earlier century? I mean, how is the church playing on the kind of the modernity and the old ecclesial aspect of the morality teaching?
Well, I should say that I was searching for kind of roots. I was trying to find out when this concept of traditional values was first used. And according at least to the Eastview database, which collects sources. So the first mention of it was from 1980s in a Soviet newspaper Izvestia. And this was an article about American Christian right. And it was basically an article criticizing that in the West, there are people who want to morally recover American society, and they are completely wrong because it is capitalism, which is the problem. So yes, it's something very new. And the language of traditional values is the language of American Christian right. It's the language of culture wars in America that was later adopted by Russian moral conservative actors.
And our colleague Jason Roberts, who will be talking in the next panel, was replying to Masha that the patriarchs is referring to the notion of a holy tradition, right? So there is a way of trying to connect maybe semantics and current debates to this kind of notion of holy tradition in order to make the link with kind of classic Christian ecclesiastic text. So that's something that I think we can continue to discuss. We have more questions coming on the relationship between conspiracy theory and conservative values. So that seems to be something that is really of interest. And so if you could add more on that. I know Dima also had an article that in a sense is also addressing that kind of complex interaction.
Maybe just very quick, and then I give the word to Dima. There is an element of conspiracy theory, of course, in the evaluation of what the LGBT movement is and what gender rights are in contemporary world. Now, the conspiracy that is like a gay lobby that is trying to infiltrate and to change the world and to obtain power. That's a conspiracy theory that's very powerful also in the Christian right in the West. And that's something that we now see completely prevalent in the Russian discourse when the Patriarch gives a sermon and says, you know, we have to invade Ukraine in order to prevent gay parades from taking place.
Well, I should say that in this book, we took not a national, but a transnational perspective. So we consider Russian moral conservatism as a transnational phenomenon. And in that sense, when we are talking about conspiracy theories, I'm not sure that there are some authentic Russian conspiracy theories. I think there's kind of a global pool of conspiracy theories, and how to say, all members of this Moralist International, they take something from this global pool of conspiracy theories. And in that sense, yes, the kind of conspiracy theories that we see in Europe, in America, we also see them in Russia. What Kristina mentioned about these LGBT conspiracy theories. And yes, they're very, very, very influential.
Thank you. And we have 5 more minutes. So if I can add a question, you briefly mentioned that one of the specificity of the Russian case is that Islam is seen as part of the traditional value agenda as a partner, right? And not at the enemy. I mean, I think in the West, you had that ambiguities also. Huh? You had the Baptist burqa kind of partnership. So you also had some will of kind of talking to Muslim actors in partnering against kind of secular progressive values, and at the same time, the kind of xenophobic aspect. But could you develop a little bit on how you think the church has been trying to talk with Muslims, either domestic like spiritual boards in Russia or on the kind of the global scene, in trying to have them involved in the general discussion? For example, I guess on abortion and same-sex marriage, there was probably partnership and kind of shared values also at play there.
Well, okay.
Yes, no, go ahead.
I will start. Yes, first of all, I will say that Muslims were part of this Moralist International, at least when we studied World Congress of Families. There was a period when they were communicating with Muslim actors. So they thought that Muslims could be their partner, but it all finished after 9/11. So these contacts became impossible. And concerning Russia, yes, I mean, this was the big idea of Father Vsevolod Chaplin, who is not with us anymore, but it was his big idea. He was constantly talking to different religions in Russia, to Buddhists, to Muslims, to Jews, basically saying that we have a common platform, traditional values. Let's all unite. Yes, we have dogmatic differences, but on the level of values, we are together. Let's fight secularism. Let's fight liberalism. But yes, it's a problem because for Muslims, traditional values are a bit different from traditional values for Christians. And also there is a huge pluralism concerning abortions and all these bioethical issues in different religions. So everything is not that simple. But as a platform against liberalism, secularism, it's a good platform, yes, to bring together Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Jews, and so on.
Kristina, I let you add, you're muted. I let you add
yes,
the last.
I would say there is not, you know, the Moralist International is something that existed before Russia played an important role, and it will exist also if now Russia's soft power diminishes. And in that Moralist International, there are different cleavages. So there was the Christian Muslim, but there is also, in a way, a racist cleavage potentially, which I think plays a big role in the US now. You have a whole big debate about white Christian nationalism, but which on a global scale, African countries are very important for the support of conservative values, and now also Russia reaching out to African countries. So I think, you know, this is just one more of the cleavages I can think of, and maybe we could think of others. But the main point, in a way, I would maybe now want to say to conclude, is that this story has a starting point and it continues. And what we in a way did in the book, and we didn't expect this to happen, is to explain that window where Russia was really important. And I really think that now the war in Ukraine changes the cards on the table, because Russia has now become toxic also for conservative actors in the West and in other countries.
Wonderful. Well, I think on that, that's a great way to conclude this first panel. So I wanted to thank Kristina and Dmitry for their presentation, and congratulations once again on this great book. And I invite everybody to download the book, because it's so good to have available free ebooks. So please do that and spread the word on this really great contribution. So Dima and Kristina, thank you so much. And I propose now we move, we move directly to our second panel.